The last decade of American politics has seen an increasing focus on criminal justice reform and criminal justice policy. But what actually works when it comes to reducing the harms from the criminal justice system while also reducing crime? Jennifer Doleac is the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, a former researcher on criminal justice policies, and the author of the new book, The Science of Second Chances. This book examines in great detail which criminal justice interventions and which policies actually help people and which ones simply fail to work. Jennifer joins the podcast today to talk about her book and why it's important to follow the evidence and how our public conversations about criminal justice are often lacking in substance. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. Share with your friends, share with your family, share with anyone you meet on the street, frankly. We appreciate all of it. And if you really want to support the podcast, if you really want to support the work we do here at the Center for New Liberalism, consider becoming a member. Join a local chapter, get involved with politics, advance the cause of liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Jennifer Doleac. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Been a while since we've had you on. I think the last time we were probably talking about your well-known naloxone paper, but that's a controversy that has popped up many times in the past few years. But today we're talking about your new book. I'm going to hold it up here, The Science of Second Chances. And it is a book about criminal justice reform. So I want to start off with, how do we prevent all crime ever?
Well, I will be a stereotypical economist here and say the optimal amount of crime is not zero. Right? The world we'd have to live in to have zero crime is not a world anyone would want to live in at the level of
that is an extremely economic answer, by the way. No, I really enjoyed the book. I got a chance to read it. And it's funny. There's a type of book that I normally don't like very much. And sometimes I read this because I read a lot of policy books. There's a type of book that is just like, I have a bunch of policies that I like, and here's just a list of them, and I'm just going to tell them to you in a long list in book format. And that type of book doesn't always connect with me. So as I read through books, I'm normally trying to see what is the through line here? Is there a larger philosophy guiding this? And what I realized halfway reading through your book, and I don't even know if you intended this, but to me, the book is not just about criminal justice. It's a love letter to the credibility revolution, essentially. So I'd really love to start off by saying, for all the listeners who might not be familiar with that term, what is the credibility revolution? And do you think it informs your book?
Yeah, no, I love that. So the credibility revolution in economics in particular is the period that the economics profession went through where we developed a toolkit to really be able to distinguish correlation from causation without needing a randomized controlled trial, right? So the ideal experiment that we have to be able to tell if a program or intervention works is to randomize people into the treatment group or the control group as if they were in a lab experiment. And it just turns out in the real world, that's really hard most of the time, if not actually impossible or unethical or illegal. So for the criminal justice space, you can't actually randomize people to go to prison or not, right? That would be illegal. And yet we want to know what the impact of prison is. And so how do we do that? And so economists have now become completely obsessed with distinguishing correlation from causation because we went through this credibility revolution. But basically, we go around looking for natural experiments that approximate that ideal lab experiment. And that, I think, to most economists is the fun part of the job. It's kind of like a treasure hunt, I guess, and trying to find those cool natural experiments that can really tell us the causal effect of something. But yeah, so that's the credibility revolution. And I think you're right. I mean, most of the the studies that I talk about in the book really are um, examples of that those types of tools or that toolkit in action. And so you're right. The book is nominally about criminal justice policy and how to make it better and what we've learned from research, but it's also about how we learn, right? Like how people like me, how economists study this, approach this field, and how we determine whether our policies and programs are working. Because most of the time, you could argue it both ways, whether something could work. And we really need to just see what happens in the real world in practice to know if something is as effective as we hope it will be.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of people who are steeped in kind of modern economic studies realize how, I don't want to say bad because they were working with different tools, but I'll just say how bad it used to be
Mm,
in terms of whether it's economic growth or whether it's, whether or not welfare helps people or whether it's not criminal justice topics. You used to you'd come up with some kind of economic theory. Well, maybe this incentive drives people to do this. And maybe you do a little bit of math, but it mostly just stayed as a theory. You'd build a model of the world and say like, maybe that's how it works. Maybe growth is, endogenous and a function of technology, and who's to say? Or maybe in criminal justice, maybe people have a taste for discrimination, for
mm.
instance, and that's why it's hard for certain races of people to get hired at certain rates because of taste-based discrimination. And then you kind of just stopped. And the amount of times in this book that you say, well, here's a theory, how can we test it with data? I realize like this is a love letter to like causation, to actual experimental methods.
Well, in the scientific process, right? I mean, I think what you're describing is a really important part of trying to figure out how to solve problems. It's the hypothesis generating phase. And lots of social scientists spend lots of energy generating hypotheses about what might work based on descriptive data that they see in the world or their experience of the world. But economists in particular are in the hypothesis testing business more than most. We like generating hypotheses too, but we're especially interested in generating hypotheses that we can go out and actually test. And so that's what the empirical toolkit is that we're bringing to the table.
So one of the things the book does, among a couple things, is it talks about the kind of modern state of criminal justice research. And there's a lot of different ways this is approached. This is approached through looking at does prison actually deter crime? Do specific interventions when criminals are released from prison, do they actually help them not go back? There's a lot of ways of looking at this. And one of the things that kind of struck me about the book is that we're disappointed a lot in a lot of these interventions. So can you give an example of something where, criminal justice advocates or people who are doing activism in this area had an idea that they really thought was going to be a great idea. This was going to help people. This is going to make the criminal justice system fairer and better and make society safer. And it just ended up not working that well.
Yeah, there are a bunch. So economists are good at distinguishing correlation from causation. We're also good at delivering bad news. So we're often the downer at the cocktail party saying that didn't actually work that well, which is why we need the research, right? Which is why we need to go out and test things in the real world. So one of many examples is wraparound service programs for people coming out of prison. So this is the idea here is people coming out of prison, if we want to help them, help put them on a better path, help them reintegrate successfully. A lot of really well-meaning nonprofits and government agencies, honestly, have developed programs that then when they actually start working with the people they're trying to help, they realize, oh, whatever one or two things I was going to do for them, that just doesn't seem like enough now. I see how many challenges they have. They don't have a government ID. They don't have a car. They don't have anywhere to live. They need more education. They need some job training. They are struggling with substance use. And so they just have like all of these needs. And so these programs expand and expand and expand to add more and more components to be a full wraparound service, which is where the name comes from.
Kind of a full service, full detail, like,
Right.
the deluxe package of interventions. It's trying to do everything all at once.
Trying to do everything all at once, right? And they're extremely well-meaning, and And really based on the experience in the real world that like, oh my gosh, just giving someone an ID if they don't have an ID doesn't seem like enough because they still have all these other problems. And so trying to expand to meet all these needs sounds great. Really, I'd say most reentry programs out there probably fit this model. But now we have several really big randomized trials of these types of programs that are, gold standard programs that that were highly respected, and the effects are disappointing at best. They're null effects. They're generally statistically insignificant differences between those assigned to get this treatment and people who didn't. But on average, it's not just the statistical power issue because the people who are in the treatment group on average actually do worse than those in the control group. Not statistically significant difference, but it's going in the wrong direction, if anything. So it really does seem like, these really well-meaning programs are not effective, which is really in some ways counterintuitive because if you just look at one-off pieces of the programs, if you just look at cognitive behavioral programs or just look at providing healthcare or just kind of individual or just giving people some cash, those things work. And
Yeah.
so it really does feel like there's something about trying to do everything at once that is actually counterproductive and canceling out the benefits that any one of these interventions could have.
And this is interesting because it leads me to ask a question about like how easily can we extend the results that we see? Like this, you can extend this all the way out into a broader question about the academic crisis of replication that is hitting all sorts of fields, all sorts of social science, right? And economics and criminal justice research is no exception. But when we have a positive result, we see a result that this particular thing works, this particular other thing does not work. How much of that is, oh, well, this one program just had a great administrator and we can't copy them 50 times, so it's going to fail everywhere
Yeah.
else. But we don't know that. Or, sometimes it's just, it's endlessly frustrating for me because you really want these things to work. You want there to be some kind of magic bullet where we can just, there's a way to solve this problem. If we just learned what it was, it would work. And it's much slower and more frustrating than that.
Yeah, and I do want to say I'm very much an optimist that solutions to these problems exist. I where I'm a pessimist is on whether any one idea we come up with is going to be the solution that works. And so that pushes me to really be calling for everyone to adopt an approach where we just try to fail fast rather than pretending we're not going to fail, right? Because it'll speed up the rate at which we eventually find the solution. One thing I think a lot about now in my role at Arnold Ventures is the replication side. So as a researcher, all of the incentive is in doing is writing the first paper about something and showing like, testing some hypothesis and demonstrating something novel. And
And you were an academic. You felt that pressure.
yeah,
You know firsthand that, yeah,
yeah,
you want to write a buzzy, controversial paper that gets a lot of eyeballs that nobody's ever written about before.
yeah.
You've done that kind of work before. So
Totally. And so that's where the academic incentives are. But now that I'm on the funder and policy side, I think a lot about, well, how can we provide incentives to get academics to do the stuff that are the stuff that's useful for science and for society beyond just writing the first paper that shows us something that maybe we didn't know before. And so I do think a lot about, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy is a type of program where we have a bunch of RCTs, randomized trials of individual CBT programs for high-risk youth or men in prison or just other kind of groups who are where their decision making might benefit from this type of intervention. So cognitive behavioral therapy is basically tries to help people slow down their thinking, so they're reacting less impulsively or less based on kind of their default mode and thinking through basically backing up and saying like, wait, what are the facts I know here? What are the pros and cons? And trying to make more deliberate decisions. These types of programs have been shown to have really big impacts on violence. But then someone like me in my position now, looks at that and says, great, but what exactly are we telling lawmakers to do with that information? Like, just implement CBT programs is not actually that helpful, because there are a zillion of these programs out there, and we don't actually know if they're all as effective as these few programs that were found to be real.
And when you're a policymaker, you're working with a limited amount of resources,
Yep.
and that's one of the big tragedies of bad policy is that the misallocation of resources, I would say, towards programs that don't work is a really big issue.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so if we want to help lawmakers use their scarce resources as effectively as possible, which is, what every economist is really trying to do, is help to allocate scarce resources. We think a lot about now, let's go out and replicate each of these one-off programs that have been shown to be effective and build the evidence based around each individual, like, program, specific program with a manual that we could hand to someone and say, do this if it continues to work. So really trying to go beyond the first study and build a replication base around specific interventions that convinces us that this is effective and it wasn't just the result of publication bias or something else that we need to worry about in the scientific space.
So the book has a lot of detail about a lot of different numbers of interventions, policy choices that you can make about criminal justice at many different levels about, do long sentences matter versus does the probability of getting caught matter? How do DNA databases interact with, reducing crime? How do different probation programs and their strictness, even as far as like, what if we remove particulate matter and lead from our environments? What does that do? There's a lot of detail in this, and I encourage people to pick up the book. It's a good read. You will come out of this knowing more.
Mm-hmm.
But while I want to talk a little bit more about some of those, I also think a lot of these topics, when we get into kind of the common discourse, it often operates at a higher level where rather than debating the particulars of policy, people are talking about things like, is crime even a thing we can adjust with incentives, or is this some kind of indelible condition? Like, some people are born criminals,
Mm-hmm.
some people are just bad eggs, and we just have to punish them until they are, cowed into submission, kind of. I'm probably not stating this view super accurately, but there's some people who think along those lines, whereas some people think nobody's born a criminal. Nobody's ever born with a bad heart, and they only ever do it because of socioeconomic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of kind of the discourse just exists at this like meta narrative level. Do you engage in that at all? Do you think about those sorts of issues, or do you try to stay more narrowly focused on like, well, let's just test things that we actually can test with data, or do you worry about the bigger theories as well?
I think of all those theories again as being hypothesis generating, right? So if you think so in some ways it's you can think of it as being a debate about the root causes of crime, or nature versus nurture, or all of these other kind of big things. One way I often describe this is, it feels like a lot of our public discourse around crime is the fringe 5% of the population on the far left saying this is all about environmental and social factors, and we just need to reduce poverty, abolish prisons, abolish police, put all that money into social services. And then you have the fringe 5% on the far right saying some people are just morally corrupt, and the best thing we can do is just lock someone up after their first mistake, right? And lock them up forever, throw away the key. And I think the middle 90% of the country looks at that and says, those are options? Like, those both seem really unsatisfying. Like, surely there's a mix of both going on here, right? There's society and the environment matters some, our policies matter, and people's just natures matter. Like, we're all just different and have different personalities. And so to me, those kinds of debates are at their root hypothesis generating based on your view about the world. What do you think we could do to reduce crime? So, each of those fringe views suggests some interventions that we could try. My view is, okay, cool, let's go try some stuff. You know, they have ideas, other people have ideas. Let's just go out into the real world and try things based on what their ideas are about what causes
Y-
crime.
You're such an
And
economist right now, again.
very much, very much. And then we'll see what happens, right? And so yeah, I think people spend a lot of time on those debates, and I think they are largely a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, and there's other things you can get into here. You can get into the whole philosophy of why we punish people, right?
Mhm.
Do we punish people in order to hit some utilitarian aim? We just want to improve outcomes. We want there to be less crime,
Uh-huh.
and punishment and jailing people is just a function of trying to get less crime on the streets. Or are we punishing people? Are we jailing people, I should say, to punish them? That this is what they deserve and some moral just desserts kind of thing. Like there's a lot of these high level philosophical things you can get into, and maybe these are really valuable things, but it's kind of not it's not necessarily where progress is being made, I think.
Yeah. Although on that last point, I mean, I do think it's a useful I have this conversation all the time with lawmakers now, right? Like, why do we punish people? And I think it is useful to step through the different reasons that we use prison, for instance. We lock people up partly for incapacitation. Actually taking someone off the street, out of the community, prevents them from continuing to harm the community, right? So that is helpful if someone's an active public safety threat. We put people in prison in the hopes of deterring them from committing crime in the future, from deterring the rest of the community from committing crime in the future. We also put people in prison, hopefully, as an intervention point. We have programs in prison that could ideally put that person on a better path, provided a rehabilitative component. And the fourth reason is retribution. We think you've done something bad, you deserve to suffer for it. And so even if we weren't getting any public safety benefit from prison, we might still want to lock someone up for a long time because we value that retributive component. And and I think it's useful to step through those four things because I, as an economist, can say a lot about the first three, right? I can say a lot about the first three are empirical questions. Are we getting incapacitation, deterrence, or rehabilitative effects from this intervention? And if we do, I can think of ways to measure those in the real world. What's the impact on crime if we use this intervention? I cannot, as an economist, tell you how much retribution or mercy someone deserves. That's a matter of preferences and moral values. You and your church, your pastor might want to discuss that, but that's not something I can use data to help figure out. But I do find that just naming those four reasons helps everyone in the room who might really differ on how much they value retribution or mercy, right? Understand, like, what is it we're talking about here? We're not debating what sentence should someone receive. We're really talking entirely about the public safety benefit. And that is a part of the reason we sentence people, but it's not the whole reason. So I think it just kind of, you have, if I have those conversations, you can actually visibly see people's shoulders lower, right? And they relax a bit and they're like, okay, this doesn't have to be a political fight. Trying to understand the pieces where data can inform the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about how much you now kind of interface with people in policymaking positions. Most criminal justice in this country is done, I believe, at the state and local level.
Mhm.
That far outstrips federal prison is a real thing, but that is not most of the people that we jail, as far as I understand it.
Yeah.
And so you're going around talking to state legislatures and people who work for various bureaus of prisons or whatever they're called in different
Mhm.
states. And something I'm sure you run into over and over and over is people who have very, very good intentions. They have the best of intentions. Nobody gets into this because they want to hurt people. People are not in politics because for the vast majority of people because they're cackling evil goons or whatever. Like most people want to do good policy where they can do it.
Yeah.
Even if you disagree with them ideologically, like about what good is, like they're trying to do something good. They have very good intentions, and they've put those good intentions behind a policy that doesn't necessarily work,
Yep.
where the evidence just isn't strong. How do you approach those conversations? Could you give me an example of one type of that kind of policy that, in your experience, just doesn't have good evidence for it, but it has been popular, and you've had to talk to lawmakers about why this doesn't actually work? Like, how does that go? Or have you had any success? Are they normally resistant? I'm just very curious about how those conversations happen.
Yeah. You know what? I have been very pleasantly surprised by this in my time at AV so far. So I've been in this job for um, bit 2.5 years, a little over 2.5 years. It's rapidly approaching 3 years, but it was still about 2.5 years. And I think when I first took this job, I thought that more of the fights would be about whether or not to consider evidence and like whether science even matters, or like there's that people maybe knew the evidence but wanted to ignore it. And I find that in practice, it's much more, especially at the state level, like lawmakers tend to be part-time. They typically don't have a staff. It's the vast majority of people I talk to, and I'm struggling to even think of someone that would not fit this mold, are people that genuinely want to figure out the solution to these problems. They just don't know who to ask, right? They don't have the information. They're doing their best to do research in their downtime when they have a full-time job on top of this gig, right? And they don't have people to help them. Maybe they've got an unpaid intern or something during the session. But really, I and my colleagues come in and we offer to introduce them to the best researchers who study particular issues, or to give them ideas based on the evidence, and they're just so grateful. They just need help. They just need help. And so that has been really gratifying to know, like, the fundamental problem here is not, certainly out there is some distrust of science, and that's something to think about bigger picture. But in the day-to-day conversations I have, the issue is much more just that, like, the politicians and the research communities do not know each other. And so it's just a matter of, like, it's a very human network problem. Like, how do we put these people in the same room so they can get to know each other, build some trust, and be a resource to one another? And that is a much easier problem to solve than some concern about, like, should we listen to the elites or something, right? It's just a very human problem. So I mean, one example to your question and where this comes up a lot is ban the box policies. So I have a paper on ban the box, which is a policy that aims to increase employment for people with criminal records. We know that employers discriminate against people with records, that they're reluctant to hire people with a criminal history. And that is.
And this is an important kind of outcome, because if somebody has a steady job, theoretically, they should be much less likely to commit more crimes. They should be much less likely to end up back in prison. Like, this has all sorts of positive things. We want people with criminal records who are coming out of jail or whatever, we want them to get jobs.
Right, right. So you could imagine, in economic terms, there are positive externalities if an employer hires someone with a criminal record, because it's very likely to help that person build a stable, crime-free life and not commit crime in the future. And so that's the justification for the government to intervene in this market, right? Is that there are positive spillover effects if employers hire people with records. But the traditional approach on the policy side to this has been, well, employers are asking for this information that we wish they would not care about. And so now let's tell them they can't ask anymore. So ban the box removes the question from a job application. It's usually a little box you check. That's the box that you're banning, asking if you have a criminal record, or especially a felony conviction. And if you check yes to that, then anecdotally, they just throw your application away. So let's remove that box. Employers can still check your background at the end of the hiring process, maybe after a conditional offer's been made. But in the meantime, you have an opportunity to get your foot in the door, build rapport with the hiring manager, convince them that you've learned from your mistakes and that you'd be a great employee. The problem with this is someone like me hears about this policy and I think immediately about statistical discrimination. And so I worry as an economist that if someone cares about some information, but they're no longer able to see it or ask about it directly, then they're going to try to guess based on the information they still do have. And in this case, race in particular might be a particularly salient characteristic that is statistically correlated with whether someone has a record because of the racial disparities in criminal histories in the US. So what I was worried about especially is that young Black men without a college degree, say, would be really hurt by this policy if they can no longer signal upfront that they have a clean record. And so have research on this showing that is in fact what happens. Employment for young Black men goes down after ban the box policies go into effect. There's other research, including a really cool field experiment by Amanda Agan and Sonia Starr, showing the same thing happen. The same thing in a couple of cities that they were able to run their field experiment in. And so these policies are still in effect. They're still being proposed in places that haven't adopted them yet. A new variant on them, I think of as a new variant, clean slate
I
policies.
may actually be interviewing someone in like a week who is actively campaigning to ban the box.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to decide if the interview's not about criminal justice per se, but I'm thinking maybe I should ask them about it. Like, have you
Ask
read
them
some of
about it
this
if they know
research?
the research. Right. And I think this is a place where most people I talk to they genuinely just don't. If they're on this decision-making side, they haven't heard about the research, which surprises me because like I've been in this space and the research came out 10 years ago. Right. And so it's like, well, pay attention.
Well, let me ask you about this.
Yeah.
I'm curious because you're describing on one hand, like, look, this is an area where you've talked to people and they've changed their mind, and that in general, not just for ban the box,
Yeah.
but in general, it seems like when you talk to policymakers, that they are actually very open to changing their mind and that they are hoping to do things that are evidence based.
Mm.
And I believe you. I wouldn't call you a liar, but I think there's a very different conversation that happens in the public that is very much not that. And you've experienced this where there's another way these issues like ban the box or like your famous naloxone paper get discussed in the public, which is Jennifer Doleac or whoever, Arnold Ventures, Jennifer Doleac, whatever researcher has come out saying that we shouldn't ban the box. This is because she hates black people and wants them to die, like or something. She wants to imprison people. She's a servant of the carceral state. She's a this, she's a that. And it gets, number one, very personal very
Yes.
fast.
Mm-hmm.
And it is just completely divorced. It actually gives me a lot of optimism that our elected class is not like this. But like, I guess I have my theory. But before I go off on my little rant, why do you think there's such a difference between the public discourse, we'll call it the social media chattering class,
Mm-hmm.
and the actual electeds who seem to be much more calm?
Yeah. And it's not that the electeds are immune to this, right? But I do think it's just a more civilized conversation. And maybe it's just any offline conversation is better than any online conversation. That might be it. But yeah, I think the nature of most public discussions these days is we assume everyone's on one political team or another. And the way we generally interact with research on those political teams is that we look for research that supports our team and accuse anyone who has research supporting the other team as just mindlessly backing that other team. And
this is the lamppost theory of evidence, if you've heard that.
Just looking under the streetlight for.
There's actually a second one. Sorry, second, awesome. We're going to do a second analogy. I'm aware of that one, but sometimes I'll say that somebody uses research like a drunk uses a lamppost, not for illumination, but for support.
I love it. Yes. Yes.
They just want support. They don't actually care what's being illuminated.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's right. So I mean, one way that we deal with this at AV is and especially our advocacy team will try to make it really clear up front. We're going to gore everyone's ox, to use another analogy, right? Like we have policy proposals and positions that just simply do not align with any team. We're going to sometimes say the left got this one right, and we're going to say they got this one wrong. And we have our slate of policy priorities does not fit neatly in terms of any political platform. There's stuff on both sides that people would like and dislike. And so I think that gives people confidence that like, oh, maybe they are just following the evidence, which is what we say we're doing.
I agree with all this broadly. I sometimes call this the friend-enemy distinction, where like there's kind of two methods of making an argument online. There's the method where you're trying to find truth and you're trying to break things down and you're trying to argue in good faith. And this is very productive and it's beneficial and it's rare.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the method of arguing where essentially your arguments are like soldiers on your team.
Yeah.
And if you ever admit, well, I still believe in the idea of blah, 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 but this particular argument isn't very good, all you've done is you've stabbed your own soldier in the back. You've given aid to the enemy in a time of war.
Right.
And, you are a traitor to the cause when, from the first perspective, you're just trying to seek the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that's how a lot of, politically charged discussions go these days. And really, frankly, you can extend this to a lot of things. You can extend this to how sports fans talk about their teams. Are they
Totally.
rationally debating whether or not Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback?
Yeah.
Or are they just screaming at each other using whatever statistics support their guy?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right, and it is often extremely frustrating. I mean, it's certainly and again, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture about the state of politics, even at the state level. Although at the state level, I do think it is much, much, much better than at the federal level, which is mostly just going after, in my experience, cable news headlines, right? But the other thing that I and my team work really hard on, and that I've tried to do in the book, is present a whole bunch of ideas that aren't either firmly attached to a particular team yet or that no one's ever heard of before. I think that's the other place we can really add value, is to say, this doesn't just have to be a debate about police and prisons, right? Have you considered lead abatement? Have you considered, 24/7 sobriety programs, right? They're just a whole
air filters in schools, baby.
Air filters in schools.
I am a PM 2.5 truther.
Yeah.
I think every paper I've ever read on PM 2.5, which is more than I should have,
yeah,
is I keep saying look, this is a weird paper. The effect can't possibly be that big.
Yeah.
And then I read the next paper and I say, look, the effect can't possibly be that big. And after the 7th or 8th one, I'm like, okay, it's that big every single time. So no, I agree. I think, again, to listeners, the book has a wide breadth of stuff. It covers a lot of stuff. It covers environmental stuff. It covers, length of prison sentences versus certainty of being caught. It covers post-prison programs. It covers educational interventions. One thing I wanted to ask you about, just in the spirit of things that don't often get talked about, because it seems to me like this is something that's not in the discourse. I have done podcasts on crime. I've done podcasts on drugs. We've done podcasts on pollution and policing. I've never heard anybody in the discourse talking about DNA databases. But that's one of the very first things in your book. And this just seems absent from the popular discourse to me.
Yeah.
Talk to me about DNA databases and what we know about them, I guess.
Yeah. So I was just in Nashville this week talking to lawmakers about DNA databases. A lot of states are considering expanding their DNA databases right now to include felony arrestees, which I argue is in line with the evidence. And so yeah, I think this is a great example of a place where the evidence, we debate, do we lock people up forever, or do we abolish police and prisons? And the evidence actually says what we should be doing is focusing on increasing the probability that people are caught when they do offend. Solve more crimes faster. That actually is the thing that will give us a really big bang for our buck in the public safety space. Mostly because most people on the margin of committing crime just aren't thinking very far ahead. And so they're not deterred by long sentences. Most people age out of crime quickly, so there's not a really long incapacitation effect if you lock them up for 20 years instead of 2 years. But
this is hard because what can legislators do? It's very easy for a legislator to just say, well, let's double all the sentences. We can write that in a sentence and put it in a bill and boom, done.
That's right.
But how does a legislator actually say, well, let's just catch more murderers?
Let's catch more people. Right. So one way is law enforcement DNA databases, which I wrote my dissertation on in grad school. This is what initially got me into the criminal justice research space. And so these are databases where it's basically just a better fingerprint. So people hear DNA and they think that we're uploading their entire genome to 23andMe. And that's not what the government's doing here. They take a DNA sample and basically code the non-coding pieces of your DNA. So intentionally go after what they think of as the junk DNA pieces in your genome. And that produces a string of numbers, not unlike a social security number, where the individual numbers don't mean anything, but together they are uniquely identifying. And that string of numbers is what's uploaded to the database. And it is useful only for matching to DNA samples. And so if you commit another crime and they collect the DNA at the scene and they do this analysis and they upload that DNA identifier to the database and it matches to your profile, then that generates a lead in the case as if they found your fingerprint at the scene, right? It's just a better fingerprint. And so my research has shown that this has a really big effect on recidivism. It reduces recidivism. And so the way I do that is look at people who are arrested or charged or convicted, whatever the triggering event is, just before and just after a database expansion goes into effect. So the person charged just before the expansion does not go in the database. The person charged just after the expansion does. And so that's your natural experiment. It's basically a coin flip. One person got lucky, one person got unlucky. And you follow those people going forward, and it turns out the person in the database is 40% less likely to reoffend. And that's huge in a context where most of our reentry programs don't work, right? Those wraparound service programs I talked about earlier are so expensive, so time consuming, and have no benefit. And this is something that, because you're increasing the probability of getting caught, does change human behavior. And this is in line with a whole bunch of other evidence we have pointing the same direction. This is the reason that hiring more police reduces crime. You don't steal a car in front of a cop because you know you're going to get caught for it. Cameras reduce crime for the same reason. So anyway, yeah, expanding law enforcement DNA databases is one way that we can dramatically reduce crime by increasing the probability of getting caught. And I genuinely believe that tools like this, interventions like this, are our ticket out of mass incarceration.
It's so interesting you say that, because to me, this is another thing that economists are very comfortable with, that people in other social sciences might not be, which is trade-offs. Obviously, there's a trade-off to cameras on every corner, or putting everybody's DNA into a database. If we're doing it for criminals, why not just do it for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Then we would be very certain everybody would be caught.
Mm-hmm.
But people have ideas about, the freedom of not having your DNA in a database, privacy-related things. I don't know if freedom's the right word, but the privacy to not have your movement tracked by CCTV everywhere you go. To some people, that feels dystopian.
Yeah.
And I think some people will say, look, it's not dystopian, it keeps us safe, and so we should do it. Some people would say it's dystopian and it's privacy invading, and therefore we should not. But I think an economist kind of uniquely will say, well, look, it's both. It will keep us safe, and maybe it's a little bit dystopian. So what's the trade-off? How much privacy invasion are we willing to suffer for how much safety?
Yeah.
And that's a trade-off that we can't actually avoid.
Right. And different communities are going to make different bargains on this, right? Like it's totally reasonable that different communities will fall down in different places and say, yes, this is worth it, but that isn't. I do think it's really important not to group all of the tools that increase the probability of getting caught into one dystopian bucket, right? Like clearly there are some tools that are incredibly invasive and some tools that are much less so. Like I think DNA databases are the kind of tool where people hear DNA and think it's really invasive. And then they hear the details of it and find out, like, there are people who put that string of numbers on their business card and hand it out as just evidence that this is not an invasion of privacy in any way. We can't do anything with this information. And in a context where we take people's fingerprints, we take mugshots, it is public record that you've been arrested and convicted. This is private information, like relative to other databases you're already in. If you've been arrested, charged, convicted of a crime, this is a relatively minor, I think, invasion of privacy. Or addition to that list. But some people might disagree, and that's fine. But I do think what I try to add to this conversation is information about what the public safety benefit of the intervention is, so that we can at least have a more informed conversation about whether it's worth the costs. Because some of these tools that we're seeing, and AI is only going to make more tools possible. We're seeing it's like facial recognition is one example. We're seeing a lot of police departments experiment with drones as first responders. They can get to the scene of a crime really fast, not have the officer there, so you avoid any potential escalation between two people, right? There are a bunch of these tools that are there's so much potential here for a lot of good to happen. And also there could be some privacy trade-offs. So I think the whole game now is thinking about, okay, what is the actual public safety benefit we're getting from each of these tools, considered separately, because we don't bunch them all together, but considered separately, which ones actually work and which ones don't. A lot of them won't, right? So like, let's figure that out. And then when something does really work and has a big public safety benefit, what can we do in terms of data retention policies, strict guidance on who can access the database, whatever it is, to make us all comfortable with how the information is being collected and used? We don't just have to agree to the data being uploaded and, released on the internet or something. Like, we can have strict guidelines about who has access to it. And so we can think about how to mitigate the costs that exist. And I just hope we have a thoughtful conversation about it, given how effective these tools are in improving public safety. And the last thing I'll just say is I think people often also consider them in a vacuum and say, well, I don't like it because there are costs here. All of our tools have costs, right? I think if we think about this relative to our alternatives are long prison sentences, a police officer on every street corner, right? Like, those things are invasive also. And a lot of communities would not be happy with continuing to ramp that up. Or we just accept that there are really high crime rates, especially violent crime rates, which are terrible for communities. Crime is really costly. So I just hope everyone is able to think through these trade-offs. And I am doing the best I can to help people do that without, I have my own preferences. I don't think they're very interesting. I really think what's interesting here and where I can be helpful is just
I think they would be pretty interesting. I mean, your preferences compared to anyone else's, because you've probably read more on this subject than like anyone alive. But beyond that,
yeah.
one thing that strikes me, and I would be curious your perspective on, is that again, we could spend hours talking about micro level interventions. We
Mhm.
could go through all these little studies, and that's what reading the book is for. Rather than do that, I'm just going to tell people they should go buy the book and read the book. But beyond all these little micro interventions and this study and this thing works, that thing doesn't, I think it's important to place that in context of criminal justice has had an interesting past decade as a political topic, uh, different than it's had in any of the previous decades, I would say, starting with, I don't know, maybe Ferguson around, what was that, 2014, and moving on to different different incidents where Black Americans were treated unjustly, perhaps by the police.
Mhm.
Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, like you can rattle off a lot of these names. We had a period where it became very much in vogue and very encouraged, and people were very enthusiastic about a particular kind of criminal justice reform, centered in a particular direction, perhaps a very good reason. But then COVID happened, and after George Floyd's death, um, again, that conversation picked up steam, but we also had the unfortunate side effect of a giant crime spike. And we can kind of, there's been research debating how much of that was due to the George Floyd effect, how much of it was COVID, how much of it was other things. But we had a spike in crime across 2020, 2021, I think even 2022. And that started coming down recently, but that led to a different kind of instinct where all of a sudden people are saying, okay, well, it's good to do criminal justice reform, but we also need to bring down crime rates. And this global narrative that kind of shifts with the way that politics is shifting, does that impact your work? Does that impact the kind of things you look at? And how do you think about these kind of narratives of crime is rising, crime is falling, on a bigger scale than just individual interventions?
I think first, I guess my view on that pendulum swing back and forth is that, at the beginning, in the heyday of the criminal justice reform movement, maybe a decade ago, I think people were very focused on talking about the harms of the criminal justice system and the unintended, usually unintended consequences and costs to people and communities of a lot of our current practices, and just raising that issue and trying to undo some of that harm. And I think, and that's all well and good. And I think that was a useful conversation to have. I think where we are now seeing the reason we're seeing the pendulum swing back is that movement and that conversation lost sight of the harms of crime, and the value of public safety. And so I think where we wind up is a different way to frame the kind of fringe 5% perspectives I was talking about earlier. Some people are very focused only on the harms of the system, and some people are focused only on the harms of crime. And clearly, we should be paying attention to both. and both, if we are able to reduce racial bias and injustice in the system, people will also trust the system more and report to and be more willing to be witnesses in police investigations and so on. And that will reduce crime. So like these things are compatible, I think, fundamentally. But it's as if each side doesn't want to acknowledge the other one has a point, because then that somehow will detract from their argument to our earlier
The arguments are soldiers. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this is interesting because I think that the internet conversations around this are very different than the real world conversations. Like I'm somewhat active in New York City politics. And I remember not in this mayor's race, not in the Zoran versus Cuomo race, which was its own special kind of clusterfuck. But in the one before that, the Eric Adams victory, I spent time going up into the Bronx, into heavily Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods, talking about, the candidates that I wanted, and canvassing for them. And most of the people that I talked to in these communities were all in on Eric Adams because he was a cop. And it was very different to the narrative that was existing at that time. I think Eric Adams was first elected in 2021 at the height of kind of Black Lives Matter and reform the system. There's some people still saying abolish the police, things like that. And in the actual communities that are most affected here, they liked that Eric Adams was a cop.
Yeah.
And I just think the real world conversations around this are so different
Yes.
than the way that activists talk about it.
I completely agree. Completely agree. And so yeah, I spend a lot of time, and my team spends a lot of time just trying to be the pragmatist in the room, offering a lot of the fresh ideas that aren't affiliated with one team or another, to get to break people out of that mentality, and to move us in a direction that's actually productive.
One more kind of big theoretical question. We're coming up on time here soon, but and I apologize because I'm asking you. You wrote a book about micro level interventions and all these RCTs, and I'm asking you big societal questions. But I think that's part of the job.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have any shame about doing it. But one of the things I think about is, again, if we look at the macro level, crime today, we can debate recent rises, recent drops. But crime today is much, much less than it has been in previous decades. If we compare crime to the 90s or the 80s, or like where I live in Hell's Kitchen in 1970s, it was practically a no-go zone. And now it's like the most gentrified, Disneyland-ish kind of neighborhood. Crime is so much lower than it used to be. And yet it feels like people's concerns about crime are just as high as they've ever been. And I'm curious if you have a theory about this. Is it the perception of crime? Is it the perception of public disorder? Is there some reason why, despite crime having drastically fallen from previous decades, we still seem just as preoccupied with it?
I think part of it is just the salience of crime. Like it's an easy news headline. So we know more about the crimes that do happen, even if there are fewer of them than in the past. But yeah, other than that, I don't have a great overarching philosophy here.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I'm curious about,
Mm.
but I think that a lot of it is tied not necessarily to just crime, but to the perception of disorder, basically. That if there are visible homeless people, if there's visible signs, if you like the stereotypical thing that's been happening in San Francisco the past few years, which has actually gotten cleaned up a little bit, but if you walk through a part of San Francisco and it feels like a drug den in a war zone, it just, regardless of what the crime statistics say,
Mhm.
you're going to feel like things are out of control. I don't know. Or maybe it's social media. Maybe it's a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the disorder conversation is definitely one that we've been having the last several years, and a lot of cities dug in on. And I think there is something to people feeling unsafe when they're walking around a neighborhood where there's a lot of disorder. I think that where we've also come to, I think, as a society, is recognizing like it's okay to care about disorder for its own sake. Like you don't have to think that because there are homeless people living on the sidewalks that you might be murdered. Like that might, we can separate like even in San Francisco, there were I was out there earlier last year, and they were at the time there were more traffic fatalities than there were homicides, and yet there were still all these conversations about how much the city had declined, and it was just interesting because I think, and I did not to make light of the perceived decline, right? It was it's I think just flags or highlights how important that disorder conversation is, and that people living in cities don't want to live in a place where people are not obeying sort of an implicit social contract, and that it's okay for communities to come together and say, no, there are rules here and we're going to enforce them. So I think that's a lot of what we've seen over the last few years.
All right. The traditional final question that we often ask on this podcast, which is, where can people go to learn more? And I will obviously I'm happy to recommend the book, The Science of Second Chances by Jennifer Doleac. It's got everything we talked about here. But if people are also, they're hungry for more information about the stuff we're talking about more RCTs, more, information about criminal justice theory and what works and what doesn't, what do you use to learn? What would you recommend to people who want to keep up to date with what works in criminal justice policy and what doesn't?
Yeah. Well, my team at Arnold Ventures has a newsletter that you can subscribe to, the criminal justice newsletter on the AV website. So that's one option. I also host my own podcast called Probable Causation, that's very focused on research in this space. And so both of those things are good options. And of course, I'm on X/Twitter and LinkedIn and all the things. So yeah, you can follow me any of those places.
Well, I want to say thank you to my guest one more time. The book is The Science of Second Chances. Jennifer Doleac, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so fun.